Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the panel discussion, Money Talks, the crooked connection between corruption and illicit trade. This event is hosted by TRACIT. My name is Jeff Hardy, and I'm the Director General of TRACIT. Our mission is to mitigate the economic and social damages caused by illicit trade. And today, we're going to dig into the role that corruption plays in facilitating this problem. To do so, we're going to present the findings of our newest report, and then we'll have a roundtable discussion featuring a very interesting panel of experts. Now, before we get started, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us, especially those of you who are staying up late in the Middle East and in Asia. This is a live broadcast worldwide with 312 registered participants from 48 countries. So again, welcome. Clearly, your participation demonstrates that corruption is a subject of considerable interest. In fact, in the words of the WTO, corruption corrodes the moral and economic fabric of society. It is so ubiquitous, according to the UN, that it could be equal to 5% of global GDP or more. I guess the long story short is there are few public policy issues more challenging than eliminating corruption. And because corruption is so abstract, it's even more difficult to remedy. So when we set out to write this report, we decided to take a close look at how corruption facilitates illicit trade. That meant unpacking corruption sector by sector, looking at where it occurs, how it occurs, and the players involved. So as you go through the report, I think you'll be interested to learn from the 84 case studies, 84 case studies that we present. But I'll save those details for Ulrika's presentation that'll come in just a few minutes. Now let's get to the main part of the program. To start things, I have the honor of welcoming Transparency International's CEO, Dr. Daniel Eriksson, to present a keynote address. After that, Dr. Ulrika Banjer will give you an overview of our report and present the key findings. Now, many of you probably know Ulrika already. She's TRACIT's Director of Programs, and she is the principal author of this report. And I take this moment to thank you, Ulrika, for the excellent work that you put into this. After her presentation, I'm going to moderate a panel discussion that features Dr. Marion Jansen, who's the Director of Trade and Agriculture at OECD. Raise your hand, Marion. Dr. Tasha Hippolyte, she's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. Good morning, Tasha. Andrea Hampton is joining us from the WCO, where she's the Integrity Lead and expert on customs and anti-corruption. Andrea, great to see you again. And of course, Daria Galperina is the Director of International Public Affairs at Pernod Ricard. Daria, always wonderful to work with you. Before we start, I do have a couple of little housekeeping items that I want to mention. There is a Q&A function that comes with all these Zoom meetings. It's located at the bottom of your screen. If you do have a question, please submit that through the Q&A. We have an administrator who will receive and channel these questions to the speakers. Also, I just wanted to note that we are recording this session. It will be made available on our website in its entirety, along with all the materials, including the report, the executive summary, key messages, and everything else associated with this at our website, tracit.org. Now let's get on to the program. Let me start off by saying, when it comes to fighting corruption, I think you'll probably all agree that there's no voice more respected than Transparency International. Their work promotes accountability and integrity worldwide. So when we were planning this event, I invited Daniel Eriksson, the CEO, as I mentioned, of Transparency International, to share his perspectives and to help us set the stage for the rest of the discussion. So with that, Daniel, I'd like to invite you to make your presentation at this time.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks, Ulrika, as well. Thank you, TRACIT. It's marvelous to be invited to this plenary and to open the session with a keynote. I'm very honored. TRACIT, as an organization with private sector members, is an important player in this field, and they're through the illicit trade also in the fight against corruption, and it's a pleasure to be here. The report very eloquently elaborates on the intricate link between corruption and illicit trade and how the two feed off each other. It's very, very beyond doubt after reading the report that where you have illicit trade, you have a higher risk of corruption. What I want to extend upon in this keynote is the fact that corruption leads also to so much else than illicit trade. Illicit trade, as harmful as it is, by feeding the corruption, creates more problems for humanity. For us in Transparency International, we keep on looking at the emergence of corruption as a threat to democracy, corruption as a driver of democratic erosion, as one of the main problems. Gone are the times 30 years ago when corruption was an issue of pure financial inconvenience or loss as part of sustainable development. It is now actually a threat to our free societies. Second, we also see corruption as a major obstacle in the global response to climate change. With this, if I back off one step and say, okay, how does illicit trade relate into all of this? As I said, illicit trade provides a supply side in corruption. It provides, just like organized crime, an income source for those who want to be corrupt. This is reflected in supply chains for large multinationals and is no longer only an issue, as I said, about brand protection or financial losses. It is also an issue of ESG, environment, society, and governance, where illicit trade can endorse and support foreign dignitaries that are autocrats, dictators, or other non-democratic forces. And most evidently, we've seen that in sanctions management from autocrats, sanctions avoiding, where we see components entering the supply chains in the productions of materials that should not. And that enters, and the oil trade, we see that as well, where illicit oil enters the supply chains in the production of materials. That becomes a liability and an issue for corporations. Hence, once again, my point is that illicit trade needs to be taken very seriously outside of the very narrow niche of brand protection and financial losses. So I mentioned ESG, where I do believe that this topic should be reflected in at least the S, not only in the G, and indirectly in the E, through the diversion of funds that should have gone to the response to the climate change globally. It is a compliance issue, to a limited extent, a loss prevention issues, but we also see new areas where we can step up from a civil society perspective and really do something to address the illicit trade when we spot it. TI has and have conducted investigations. And we have, I mean, one example that I can take briefly is our case of Madagascar, where our chapter in Madagascar, together with our chapter in France, uncovered illicit trade in lychee products, where a prominent state profile had set up a monopoly on lychee and used that in order to channel funds away to their own benefits, private benefits. And the definition of corruption in our context is the abuse of public resources, public entrusted power for private gain, which was very much the case in Madagascar. In that case, we saw the organized crime that was being perpetuated expand to the vanilla sector, where the illegal forestry in rosewoods were being laundered through vanilla trade that was semi-illicit, let's call it like that, as a money laundering mechanism. And all of a sudden, we have a weakened system, a weakened governance of the country that puts the country's sovereignty and democracy at risk, all starting with what could look at the surface very innocent trade in lychee. So there was a detour to show that trade and illicit trade is much more than what it says on the box. It is now a threat to democracy. It is a threat to our global response to climate change and much worse issues. And this report very well outlines how that relationship between corruption and illicit trade nurtures each other, and thereby also our need to respond to it. I'm very happy to say that there is attention being put to this topic through this event and the report, but also from regulators. Although we are still analyzing how it could be done, the new FIPA legislation coming out of the US, the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, could potentially be used, for example, in the case of a law enforcement official demanding a bribe in order to do investigation of illicit trade or illicit financial flows or some other investigation abroad. And these new legislations will be a new tool in our toolbox as civil society, but also in your toolboxes, in order to address this growing threat. And once again, it is not a small inconvenience of brand protection or lost revenue. It is much bigger. So with that, Jeff, thank you very much, and I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you, Daniel. Excellent, interesting presentation. I'm really glad you mentioned the relationship to ESG, in particular the S part of that, sustainability. You know, illicit trade is a major factor in undermining efforts by business and by governments to achieve sustainability goals. In fact, a couple of years ago, we published a report specifically on that topic, where we mapped 12 illicit trade sectors, the impacts of illicit trade, negative impacts of illicit trade in 12 sectors against the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And in every case, we found that progress toward achieving the goals were seriously inhibited by illicit trade. So I think you really put your finger on something. I think, you know, when we first raised that, we were really one of the first voices that was starting to say, listen, we need to look at this problem of illicit trade more holistically. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. And, you know, something else that I was hoping that we could get out of this discussion were new ideas. So your reference to new legislation, in this case, the United States, the FIPA Act, you know, that gets us thinking. You know, there's different ways to look at tackling this project. And so right away in the first 10 minutes, we already have a new kind of work idea that we can take away from this. But anyway, I thank you once again for participating in this. And, you know, as we talked in the run-up to this event, I certainly look forward to greater opportunities where TRACIT and Transparency International can collaborate going forward. So thanks again. Okay, so moving on to what I consider the sort of the centerpiece. We had the entree just now. Now we're moving to the centerpiece of today's program. I'm going to ask Dr. Ulrika Bonnier, TRACIT's Director of Programs, to present the report. Money Talks, the crooked connection between corruption and illicit trade. Ulrika, you put a lot of work into this. Over to you. Let's hear it.
Thank you, Jeff. So as Jeff said, my job today is to introduce TRACIT's report. And to do so, I'm going to explain the genesis of the report, what we found, and then also the recommendations that we've outlined to address the link between illicit trade and corruption. For those who are familiar with our work, this report is one of our cross-cutting projects where we've been tackling illicit trade within the wider context of society, economy, security, sustainability, and human rights. So illicit trade is a serious threat to our economies and societies. And while each form of illicit trade has its own characteristics and drivers, we often see the same criminal groups using the same routes, the same means of transport, and the same concealment methods behind multiple forms of illicit trade. And at TRACIT, we have a chance to go beyond the segmented approach and instead consider the interconnected nature of the problem and to appreciate commonalities and points of convergence across sectors. So in our previous reports, we've looked at how illicit trade undermines the achievement of the SDGs, like Jeff mentioned, how it lowers credit rating scores and drives demand for forced labor. But then in this report, we're looking at corruption, and more specifically, how corruption is a significant factor in facilitating this crime. Illicit trade has emerged as a major policy and regulatory challenge worldwide. It encompasses a wide spectrum of illegal activities, and there are few public policy challenges more intractable than eliminating corruption. So in the absence of sufficient accountability and transparency, the motives of corrupt actors can eclipse policy prescriptions intended to maintain integrity in public sector transactions. Some of the key findings in this report are that, first, corruption is emergent in every economic sector where illicit trade occurs. And then secondly, that corrupt actions are often common across sectors, such that corruption in one sector is emulated in other sectors. Corruption is encountered during illicit trading in a wide variety of ways. I'm going to give you a few examples. We see it in interactions with intermediaries, such as transporters, customs and border agents, to facilitate the movement of illicit goods. For example, in China and Tanzania, naval officers accepted bribes to transport ivory shipments across borders without inspection. It takes place to ensure that local law enforcement officials overlook illegal factories that manufacture counterfeit or substandard goods. This happened in Italy, where a counterfeiter tried to bribe authorities after a search uncovered a counterfeit manufacturing facility and 140,000 counterfeit items in a single shop. It's also in the process of fraudulently obtaining permits and licenses to exceed quotas or in the course of regulatory inspections. And this is common in wildlife crime, where government employees are stealing blank CITES documents that they then sell to illegal wildlife traders. It's also employed to overlook illegal shipments. Oil company employees in Nigeria have been bribed to allow unauthorized vessels to load oil and to allow authorized vessels to be filled with oil beyond their stated capacity. It's there to prevent arrests and release suspects. And this happened when a rhino horn syndicate in South Africa bribed a national park official to avoid arrest after hunting and dehorning rhinos. And then finally, it's there to help evidence disappear during prosecutions, also to delay or drop prosecutions, or to return no convictions in the cases of those who are actually brought to trial. There's an example in the Philippines where a corrupt judge conferred with the suspects in a trafficking in persons case after the trafficked girls were threatened and coerced into signing a retraction of their complaint. So in addition to those 84 specific cases that Jeff mentioned that we've included in this report, we also conducted a regression analysis of Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index and the Economist Intelligence Unit's Global Illicit Trade Environment Index. And the findings were really interesting. We got an R-squared of 0.76 or 76%, meaning that there is a robust correlation between corruption, as mentioned by TI's CPI, and illicit trade, as measured by EIU's Global Illicit Trade Environment Index. So what we're seeing here is a strong relationship between corruption and illicit trade that facilitates the entire process or supply chain of illicit traders. So in this report, we also provide a checklist of fundamental measures that governments are encouraged to implement in order to improve their ability to defend against the wider societal harms of illicit trade, with particular emphasis on addressing the enabling role of corruption in perpetuating illicit supply chains. We grouped these under 3 headings, which are treaties, laws, and policies. The second one is implementation and enforcement. And then the third being the supporting environment. And I promise I will not go through all of these today, but if I can highlight 4, those would be that crimes associated with corruption and illicit trade related offenses should be criminalized and be listed as serious crimes under domestic law. The second is that an anti-corruption regime that mitigates abuse of position and sets clear rules and administrative procedures to mitigate and reduce incentives to engage in corrupt behavior is essential. The third is that combating illicit trade will require stronger controls to prevent corruption. And this will require governments to approach corruption and illicit trade more holistically with an all-of-government approach. And it will also require governments to elevate punitive damages associated with the crimes of illicit trade and the crimes of corruption. And then finally, that an anti-illicit trade policy, it needs to be included as an integral component of a national action plan to combat corruption. As corruption and illicit trade related offenses are mutually reinforcing, governments should proactively include illicit trade controls in the anti-corruption policy sphere. So these were just a few. So I strongly encourage you to read through our executive summary or access the full report on our website for the complete list of recommendations. And that was made available this morning, so that's live now. So as long as illicit trade persists as a significant part of global commerce, it will be critical to fortify policies and controls to prevent corruption and corrupt actors from compromising the integrity of the global supply chain. Preventing corruption will require strong controls and the subsequent and consistent application of these controls from the lowest to highest level of governance. So this was a short overview of what we've done in this report. And against this backdrop, I will now pass the baton back to Jeff, who will moderate today's panel discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ulrika. That was an excellent presentation. I got to tell you, I'm very proud to be launching this report into the public domain today, really. And I think the report clearly demonstrates how corruption facilitates illicit trade. I think more importantly, I'm hopeful that this body of work and our set of recommendations become useful to government policymakers and to businesses that are vulnerable to illicit trade. In fact, it's for this reason that we pulled together the panelists today to give us an initial response to this report and to our findings, and to better understand how their organizations might work with us or how they work individually to tackle this challenge of corruption and illicit trade. And as I mentioned to Daniel, along the way today, we might even identify areas of collaboration. So with that as the background, the report, again, thank you, Ulrika. I'd like to now turn to the discussion, and here's how we're going to do it. First thing is I'm going to ask each of our 4 panelists to share some opening remarks. I think 3 to 5 minutes is what we're going to do. And then we're going to do a moderated question and answer session where I'll ask 2 questions to each person. So let's start with the opening remarks. We're going to do 4 sets of 4 opening remarks, and then we'll turn to the Q&A. And I'm going to start with Dr. Marian Jansen. Again, she's the Director of Trade and Agriculture at the OECD. A little bit of background, many of you probably know her. Before the OECD, she was Chief Economist over at the ITC. Before that, she was at the WTO and the ILO. Marian clearly have a lot of experience to bring to the table. So if you would, please join us in today's session.
Thank you, Jeff, for this introduction, and very pleased to be here with you today. And allow me to start by congratulating you and Ulrike and your team for this fascinating report. That is really an interesting read, and for us at the OECD, very useful. I would, in my opening remarks, like to explain a bit why this is useful for the OECD and why we consider this theme of particular importance and of increasing importance now. So at OECD, we stand for open markets and a rules-based international trading system. And rules-based already suggests that illicit trade and corruption is not something that fits into such a system. So understanding the importance of corruption and illicit trade, how it works, and you are telling us with this report that the 2 go hand in hand, is important to understand how we can combat it. Now, I must admit, you mentioned my past, my past experiences. I must admit that when I started my career in trade at the World Trade Organization, I thought that illicit trade is a marginal something, that is something we can ignore. And actually, at the time, at the WTO, nobody was working on illicit trade. It was not a topic that we were touching on, and we considered that was okay because it's not important. But we already heard from Daniel numbers like this may represent 5% of GDP. I had a number here in my speech saying that illicit trade in only in counterfeit products may amount to 460 billion US dollars, so something like the GDP of Belgium. That's non-negligible. And Daniel, you made the point, and that's a worrying point, that corruption and illicit trade may not only threaten the climate change objectives, but also democracies. And that's of big concern. And in this context, it may not be entirely surprising that the importance, the relevance of this work has been rising in organizations like the OECD, but also in a place like the World Trade Organization. It is an organization where discussions on illicit trade now, unlike 20 years ago, now take place, in particular with a particular interest in illicit trade in medicines, where the WTO has been showing the impact on public health and safety. That's a very, very damaging type of impact that can happen in this type of illicit trade. Now, at the OECD, we have been working for quite some time on illicit trade, but over the years, and in particular very recently, the work has been upgraded to something that is called a formal working party. We have a formal working party on combating illicit trade now, and that working party now reports to the Trade Committee, showing the relevance for international trade, open markets, rules-based trading system, and connecting to this relevance at the WTO. So your report is very interesting for us, very relevant for our work, and I will be maybe able to come back to this later on, because it gives us further hints on what we should focus on in our work. We learn from you not only through webinars like this, Jeff, but also because we have a very active collaboration with TRACIT in the context of the work in the Working Party. It makes complete sense to strengthen that collaboration even more, in particular after having heard from you. The number of takeaways from this report. One thing I find interesting is that this report and other reports show that the potential for increased corruption, increased illicit trade appears to be particularly high in middle-income countries that have the infrastructure in place to allow for trade. Good ports, good infrastructure. Now, we are in a period where countries are investing to strengthen their ports, to improve their infrastructure, and improving ports and infrastructure is a good thing also for rules-based trade. What we are learning from the work that is currently being published is that it probably makes sense once you invest in your infrastructure that you at the same time invest in a policy framework, a rules framework, to ensure that better infrastructure does not go hand in hand with more corruption and more illicit trade, but that illicit trade and corruption are immediately combated. But I look forward to the rest of this conversation, Jeff, and to learning from this conversation for our work on combating illicit trade at the OECD. Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. We'll come back to you in the Q&A in a few minutes. I just wanted to note this point you made near the end of your remarks. I think it's a very, very important point because, you know, the WTO, the OECD's trade committee are very focused on trade facilitation. You know, how can we move, you know, we have an increasingly global supply chain. How do we move products from one side of the world to the other? How do we do that more efficiently? How do we do that with fewer environmental emissions? How do we do that with the ever increasing demand for shorter delivery time? Right? And if you look at it, with so much of what your organizations are doing are focused on how do we squeeze out those little bits of efficiency? How do we maximize GDP by doing so? But if you look at the flip side of that, if 5 to 7% of the maritime containers are illicit, you have 5 to 7% of the shipping space, the container rental, the port authorities, the inspections are actually inefficient. because they have to go over to inspect and to care for that extra part of the trade that isn't part of your, your original calculation. So I think this is certainly an area of collaboration. I've talked to your staff about maybe digging a little bit deeper into, what those inefficiencies might look like. And I'm glad you raised that as a point. So let me now turn to some opening remarks, invite some opening remarks from our next panelist. That's Dr. Tasha Hippolyte. She's, again, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. So Tasha leads the Strategy and Policy Office there aimed at enforcing U.S. trade laws. Very interesting job you have, Tasha. And we're looking forward to working with you on what I understand is a new focus area at DHS on supply chain security. So Tasha, if you would please share with us some of your initial views.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And thank you so much to TRACIT for the opportunity to be here, to have an opportunity to read the report. I must commend you on that. I think your report is very timely. I think as noted before in the opening remarks and from our first panelist, I think this really is something that is useful for the entire community when we're talking about addressing illicit trade. As my role, as you indicated, Jeff, really to kind of set the policy for DHS in terms of trade facilitation, and that facilitation of the importation of legitimate goods coming into the U.S. market is really important. And a very interesting aspect of that I've learned since I've been here has been the engagement with stakeholders and the engagement with the private sector, the engagement with the NGOs, as well as the academia, and really looking at ways to, one, make sure that we are addressing areas that may be blind spots for us, because we don't know everything. We do truly rely on the larger community, one, to address or highlight issues and concerns. And as illicit trade and addressing illicit trade is extremely important for the work that we're doing, I think this report is really important for us to, one, focus on the aspect of corruption and the way that you tied those two together in the various sectors, some sectors that are very important for us, in ways that we're trying to tackle to effectively and efficiently address that illicit trade in some of these priority sectors here is really timely. So I had an opportunity to read the executive report and kind of going through some of the findings, and I hope that this is the beginning of a relationship where we can certainly work together. But also really wanted to go back really quickly to where I started my career. I started my career in U.S. Customs and Border Protection in the early 2000s, right after September 11 and the creation of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And I had the opportunity to work in our Office of International Affairs. And one of the main takeaways and highlights of my career was really working in that international space. In the international space of really kind of growing and that burgeoning responsibility of customs organizations around the world, and really the significance of the role that they played, and that the role that integrity certainly played in them being able to do those and to carry out those roles. And so one of the things that I certainly was excited to be able to do was engage in capacity building and some lessons learned as CBP stood up our area and our focus areas. Certainly we were established under a time where we were certainly looking at more of the kind of counterterrorism aspect of the work, and the role of the customs officer had grown. And we really had a lot of lessons learned and a lot of good practices that we wanted to share internationally. And so we were able to do that. And I think that the thing that I got out of that experience and working across many customs organizations around the world is that really having the dedication and having that organizational culture and understanding the importance of the work that you do and addressing illicit trade and addressing some of those things, but also being able to facilitate trade, which is very important for many means for many countries around the world, was essential. And so as I end my remarks here, as I'm in my career here at DHS Policy, one of the things that we've really began focusing on is supply chain resilience. And so we recently stood up a supply chain resiliency center. And in that effort, one of the things that we're looking to do is to make sure that we are able to address all of potential vulnerabilities to the supply chain in a way that we're able to anticipate it and get our head wrapped around it early, in a way that we're able to begin thinking about mitigations to those potential vulnerabilities to the supply chain. And so certainly illicit trade plays a role in that. And looking at your report and the connection to corruption to illicit trade, certainly this is an area I think that we need to take back to our Supply Chain Resiliency Center and really partner with like-minded organizations like yourself, Jeff, and really get an opportunity to understand where the vulnerabilities are there. And so we can kind of get ahead of that when we're talking about the global supply chain security and resilience. And so with that, I'll stop. There's several things that I want to come to when we get to the Q&A as it relates to kind of that connection to corruption and illicit trade and kind of what we're doing at CBP and DHS. And so thank you for this opportunity, and I really look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Tasha. I look forward to unpacking some of those things with you in the later session. You know, you mentioned some of the best practices, DHS and CBP. I mean, that's precisely why we invited you to speak. There's so much groundbreaking work that the Department of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Patrol is doing in the U.S. that I think serves excellent models. I know, you know, you're often at the WCO, our next speaker from the WCO, and sharing those best practices with others. And I just, if everyone will allow me to be somewhat opportunistic for one moment, you know, you mentioned vulnerabilities in the global supply chain. We just published a report at the end of 2023 where we looked at vulnerabilities in the global supply chain to illicit trade, and specifically we focused on 5 hot spots. In other words, where 5 places in the global supply chain where trade was vulnerable to illicit trade. And you can find that report on our website. I won't take us down a detour too much further on that, but I think you'll find it quite interesting. Let me move to our next panelist, Andrea Hampton. She's the Integrity Lead Manager for the World Customs Organization's Capacity Building Directorate. Andrea has a lot of experience in this space. Particularly, she oversees the WTO's integrity portfolio, which is exactly what we're talking about today, and includes this includes the program that probably a lot of you are either participated in or very familiar with. It's the Anti-Corruption and Integrity Program for Customs. Andrea, delighted to have you join us today, and if you would share a few words.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And Tasha stole my speech. I don't think I have anything more to say about what customs are doing. So, but no, it was a great segue and also great, you know, to see from CBP, who've been a really big supporter of our work in this area. So thank you, Tasha, and I'm happy to follow on from that. So. Yeah, I'm definitely honored to be invited to represent the WCO, the World Customs Organization, on this panel of very distinguished speakers. I'm definitely impressed by the turnout that I see online here. So that definitely shows, as you say, Jeff, just how important this topic is. I'm also delighted to have this opportunity to highlight the WCO's extensive and ongoing work, not only in combating illicit trade, which customs administrations have actually been doing literally for hundreds of years, if not millennia, so a few years longer than the OECD, it seems, but also in our work in fighting corruption and promoting integrity in customs. So for those of you who may not have heard much about the WCO before, or if you're like me and don't have a great memory for this kind of information, the World Customs Organization is an intergovernmental organization which is currently made up of 186 countries' customs administrations. 98% of the world's trade gets processed through our members, who are responsible for not only helping secure and facilitate that trade, but also the public revenues that it represents. And as the TRACIT report recognizes, a strong customs environment is essential. The WCO members have long recognized that corruption is an obstacle to all areas of customs mandate, affecting revenue collection, trade facilitation, enforcement, and security. And in response, members have made fighting corruption and building integrity within our ranks a priority for the organization. The WCO has 3 functions at its core. That's cooperation, standard setting, and capacity building. And all 3 of these core functions have been turned towards this critical issue. The WCO's Integrity Subcommittee provides a platform for members to cooperate with each other, share best practices, and find common solutions to the same challenge that all members face with regards to the threat that corruption poses to everyone's work. And the most notable example of a common solution that came out of this cooperation between members is the policy standard encapsulated in the WCO's revised Arusha Declaration concerning good governance and integrity in customs. The declaration recognizes that a holistic approach is needed to effectively respond to the threat of corruption and build integrity within customs institutions. It lays out 10 diverse but equally critical key factors that are needed in order for customs integrity programs to be effective. These are leadership and commitment, regulatory framework, transparency, automation, reform and modernization, audit and investigation, code of conduct, morale and organizational culture, and relationship with the private sector. Lastly, members help each other to implement agreed standards through WCO technical assistance and capacity building. Most recently, this work has been boosted with financial support from Norway and Canada, which allowed the creation of the WCO's Anti-Corruption and Integrity Promotion, or ACIP, program for customs. The ACIP program provides a sustained multi-year commitment of technical assistance and capacity building support to members seeking to implement integrity-related initiatives in line with the WCO revised Arusha. It draws strengths from the WCO's model of using members' own insights and experiences to ensure anti-corruption measures are concrete, practical, and make sense in the specific administrative and operational context of a customs administration. And importantly, it has given us opportunities and resources to look deeper into the matter and work even closer with members and partners looking to tackle the issue head-on. Since the WCO's theme of the year 2024 is customs engaging traditional and new partners with purpose, we are very keen to hear from the traditional and new partners on this panel today and look forward to learning new perspectives that will support our work. Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Andrea. I appreciate your remarks. To round out the panel, I'd like to introduce Daria Galperina. She's the International Public Affairs Director at Pernod Ricard. Daria leads the company's strategy on international policy matters, including trade and geopolitics. She chairs a long list of international trade committees. In addition to being a member of TRACIT, you know, Pernod Ricard is also an active member of BIAC's Anti-Corruption Committee. And I think that Pernod Ricard is also an active member of Transparency International's French division. Probably most likely, if you're not seeing Daria sipping a delicious Pernod Ricard spirit drink, you're going to find her in the halls of governments in Brussels and Geneva, where she's dedicated to educating government officials on trade issues. So Daria, it's always great to work with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff, for this great introduction, and thank you for yet another good quality report, excellent quality report. TRACIT work is famous, and particularly the quality and the depth of the analysis is very impressive. So thank you for your impressive work. And for those who don't know Pernod Ricard is the second largest wines and spirits company in the world. We have over 240 brands in our portfolio that are distributed across more than 160 markets around the world. So roughly 50% of our business is done in developed countries and 50% in developing countries. Illicit trade is a well-identified and growing concern and an important obstacle to our growth. The WHO estimates that approximately 25% of total global alcohol consumption is unrecorded, meaning either homemade or illegal. But some regions are even more exposed to the problem. In Africa, it is around 40%. For instance, in Côte d'Ivoire, we estimate that out of 5 bottles, 1 is legal, 2 are counterfeit, and 2 smuggled. This leads us to often say that our key competitor, particularly in developing countries, is an illicit trader who doesn't play by the rules and creates an unfair competition at the market. Illicit traders integrate corruption into their business model, and it contributes to 1 in 4 alcohol bottles globally being illicit. When it comes to our own practices, in Pernod Ricard, we take the question of compliance and business integrity very seriously. We believe that without integrity, there can be no sustainable success. We follow anti-bribery laws in countries where we operate and sell our products, but we also have an internal dedicated compliance team and several internal integrity mechanisms in place. So our internal code of conduct sets out the standards and rules, including also anti-bribery rules that we expect each of the employees to follow when taking actions and making decisions. There is a mandatory training explaining these rules that every employee in Pernod Ricard has to follow. We have instituted due diligence checks to all third parties that we are partnering with. And we also have whistleblowing policies and procedures in place, allowing to report suspicious behavior in a safe way. We have zero tolerance policy towards any substantiated breach of our ethical standards. Yet, fighting corruption should be an effort that private and public sectors are undertaking together. So we welcome when governments are taking commitments at highest political level to fight corruption. And we're particularly appreciative when these political commitments are translated into actions on the ground. Coming back to the TRACIT report, it points out that some of the main drivers of illicit trade encourage corruption. These drivers are high profits and low risk of detection. So indeed, with regard to high profits, illicit traders will try to reach those markets that would guarantee them higher profits. That would be particularly the case where the demand for products is high, but the supply of legitimate products would be impeded by some regulatory factors, like the level of taxes and regulations that are not appropriate to the local context. With regard to low risks of detection, indeed, if the price of being caught is lower than benefits of engaging in illicit trade, then these operators will not have strong reasons to stop their activities. Taking all this into consideration, we have some observations and recommendations that go very much in line with TRACIT recommendations and echo them. So it was already mentioned by a number of speakers, the importance of international cooperation. And we need to continue raising this issue and the need to tackle both problems of illicit trade and corruption at the international level. Problem solving starts with a political commitment to deal with it. And, fighting illicit trade, I should not elaborate much how much it would support the growth of the legitimate sustainable business, contribute to governmental revenues, create more formal jobs, reduce risks for consumers and citizens. And as already mentioned by many others, it's more than just business benefits. It is also important to reduce incentives for illicit traders through the legislative proposals. So it is important to think about the topic of illicit trade when legislative proposals are drafted and not post factum. Whenever a legislative proposal is put on the table, the legislators needs to put a question whether it will incentivize legal trade or illegal trade. And if the answer is illegal trade, at that stage of the drafting, it needs to be thought through what to do with this and how to respond. So we would absolutely agree with the need to increase the punishment for both illicit trade activities and acts of corruption. Digitalization initiatives that were already mentioned by some of you are extremely important to fight the way to fight the illicit trade and corruption. It's not only about digitalization of customs, but all agencies that have a say in bringing products in and certification. In-depth dialogue with private sector is a key. I think there is a lot of experience that we can share, and illicit trade and corruption is our common enemy, together with the governments. So putting forces together is extremely important. So for the moment, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daria. And let me thank everyone for the opening remarks. I don't know if the rest of the audience feels like me, but that's a lot to absorb. So I appreciate that. So I imagine a lot of you like me are taking notes, but let me remind you that we've recorded everything, so you can go to the website and get a recording of this. Plus, we'll also probably do a key takeaway summary of everyone's remarks. So again, thank you for the opening remarks. I'm going to immediately turn to the final part of today's presentation, webinar, which is the panel discussion, the Q&A discussion. Like I said, we're going to do 2 sets of questions for each of the panelists, and I'm going to reorganize the order just slightly because we have, what I want to do is I want to group Marion and Andrea together first because, as you know, they represent intergovernmental organizations. Intergovernmental organizations represent national governments as members, and they set standards for these member states. So I thought it might be interesting to sort of see kind of things from a top-down perspective. Then we'll go to you, Tasha, with the question from a national government, and then we'll turn to the private sector. So that's the sequence. We'll run through that twice, and then we're done for the day. So the topic for the first cycle is the role, and let me remind everyone, you know, our speakers are coming from very different perspectives, but all focused on international trade in one way or another. So we captured the first topic is to look at the role of corruption in facilitating illicit trade in vulnerable sectors of the global supply chain. So even though the questions might be slightly different to each, the main part is looking at the global supply chain. Marion, again, I'm going to start with you. And the question is, will you share with us a little bit more about OECD's efforts to counter corruption, enhance integrity and transparency in the context of trade?
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And let me maybe do this by creating a link to Daria's intervention in my answer to your question. So Daria mentioned one thing, which is it's important for countries to work and collaborate at the international level, so that what one country does in one place is somehow linked, has positive synergies, which was another country does if these countries trade. So that's per definition, the space in which international organizations are. So when we work on recommendations, on soft law, on voluntary instruments, then we have countries, members agreeing on those. Daria also mentioned that it's great if governments commit to fighting corruption, say they're going to fight corruption and or illicit trade, but that it's important also to think about how you're going to do this. And the 2 examples I would like to give some 2 examples about how we are helping members to move into action. Now, the first example I'm going to give is our trade facilitation work. And maybe I'm going to explain a bit more what this is about. When we talk about trade facilitation, it is about helping to facilitate legal trade. And it goes back to something I think Daria said, or Andrea, if the cost of doing legal trade is too high, then illicit trade becomes more profitable. Now, in our trade facilitation work, we look at what are all the steps that an exporter has to undertake to export into another country. What's the paperwork that is needed, or the digital material that is needed? What are, and you mentioned, Daria, agency collaboration. What are the agencies you have to be in touch with? Now, if, for instance, I want to export pharmaceuticals, I probably have to have documentation showing that these are real pharmaceuticals, that they are safe pharmaceuticals. That happens in one agency. I also have to deal with customs agencies in order to make that, has to recognize this documentation and has to get it, or has to make allow that it gets the pharmaceuticals get out of the country. And all these documents have to be recognized at the other side when the product arrives in the destination. Now, what we do in our trade facilitation work is try to map what are the steps that are needed, and then try to measure is this step difficult, or more or less difficult, more or less costly, or rather easy? So the easier, the more is there facilitation going on. Now, our members have agreed on a way to measure whether these steps are easy or less easy in a particular country. So already there's agreement on how to measure this. And by the way we measure this is fully aligned with how the WTO deals with trade facilitation in its trade facilitation agreement. Now, what's the purpose here? The purpose is to be able to measure whether in your country you're making legal trade costly, and by knowing whether it's costly or not, and by knowing how that's measured, you can identify as in a government, what can we do to address these costs? And the more you lower the cost, the more you facilitate legal trade, the less incentives there are, the lower the incentives to conduct illicit trade. Now, that's one example. I said I'm going to use two. And the second example is a recommendation that we have from 2019. Our members agreed on a recommendation on enhancing transparency in free trade zones. And if you look that recommendation up, you will find a multiplicity of arguments, of points that were already made in the discussion here. And I think that goes back to this idea that came up before. If you draw up a legislation like, I'm going to establish a free trade zone, think immediately illicit trade and what you need to do to combat this. So you will find in that recommendation concepts like make sure you have data available, data on who operates, how much is being traded, what is being done. Data availability enhances transparency, makes it easier to understand if something is going on that shouldn't be going on. Ensure that different stakeholders know each other and work with each other. When all other things are, when you establish a free trade zone, also make sure that you have enforcement mechanisms in place to identify illicit trade and to combat it. Same thing for corruption. And make sure that enforcement agencies are empowered to intervene in your free trade zone. Don't put the free trade zone into some kind of nowhere's land where nobody can enact legislations. That's just a few examples that you will find in this recommendation. And again, this is a recommendation our members agreed on. So it's an example of how countries collaborate and how you try to translate an ambition, combating illicit trade, into something more implementable, more practical, what you can do to combat illicit trade, in this case in free trade zones. In this work already mentioned, Jeff, we work a lot with you, with TRACIT. We also work with the World Customs Organization, and I'm very proud that we very recently in Brussels we renewed our MOU to continue our collaboration with the World Customs Organization, and therefore that's all in the spirit of collaboration that we stand for.
Yeah, thanks, Merit. I mean, I think a natural question, at least to the second part of your presentation on the recommendations on free trade zones would be, well, are there provisions there to fight corruption? But I think, the way you phrased it was at the beginning is that the whole thing really is oriented toward eliminating corruption or eliminating unlawfulness, inside free trade zones. So I think it's really a holistic tool, and we've certainly been supportive of that work. Let me move to Andrea. In your opening remarks, you told us a little bit of the ins and outs of some of the programs there were quite interesting at WC. I want to step back a little bit, maybe give us a broader perspective of how the World Customs Organization and its members, customs agencies, see the links between illicit trade and corruption.
Thank you, Jeff. Well, you're right. I mentioned the initiation of the WCO Anti-Corruption and Integrity Promotion Program, or ACIP program, which provided a recent injection of resources to our work supporting members in this area. And under this program, in the last few years, together with over 20 partner administrations of the programs, member experts, insights from the Integrity Subcommittee that I mentioned, and a network of international anti-corruption actors. We've been looking at old problems with new light. And one such problem, of course, is that link between illicit trade and corruption that's been outlined in the TRACIT report. The WCO and its members have long been on the front line of combating illicit trade, as mentioned, and the enforcement activities of customs administrations worldwide are a critical component in the global fight against it. But when we look closer at the links between illicit trade and corruption within our own institutions, we see it goes hand in hand with organized crime. And I know that's also mentioned in TRACIT's report. So although there may be some out there who believe that all customs officials are born corrupt, we know that's not the case. So we've looked instead at questions of what drives good people towards bad choices. And we know that environmental context can be a significant influence for corruption. We know that corruption often happens when three elements in the environmental context align: a need or pressure, opportunity, and a sense of impunity or lack of consequences. So one of the most insidious creators of pressure on customs officers to engage in corrupt activity is that which comes from organized criminal groups. And just as the topic of corruption is not new, neither is criminal networks' infiltration of supply chains new to the WCO and its members. And the links between organized crime and corruption are definitely becoming increasingly evident. Customs plays a critical role in protecting society from transnational criminal activities, including illicit trafficking, drugs, counterfeit products, money laundering, environmental crime, and weapons. No entity in the supply chain is immune against infiltration by organized crime, including the private sector, other government agencies, and law enforcement agencies. But customs' key role within the international trade process makes it a target for organized criminal groups. And those groups often exploit vulnerabilities in customs control and employ various forms of coercion to force customs officers into compromising their integrity when facing themselves or their families physical threats or other forms of pressure, including blackmail, extortion, and even political interference. Every WCO member has the potential to be exposed to corruption influenced by organized crime. However, understanding the problem in order to define solutions is a huge challenge because it's by nature, of course, hidden and opaque. So it's for that reason that we've taken a series of steps in the last year to help shed more light on the issue for our members. And such steps include engaging actually with Transparency International and their anti-corruption help desk to help conduct a synthesis study of academic findings to date, and organizing last November a symposium on organized crime and corruption in customs. And in fact, we're actually including the topic in our annual integrity subcommittee deliberations, which are taking place here in Brussels next week. So with these, we aim towards better understanding of the connections between organized crime and corruption in customs, and how customs as a critical institution in the fight against illicit trade can protect itself accordingly. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. You know, I started off this session saying I wanted to start with the intergovernmental organizations because you have members from around the world, right? You're comprised of customs authorities from developed and developing countries. There's an interesting question that came in asking about, you know, how do we attend to fighting illicit trade, particularly in rules and reforms in underdeveloped countries. And I'm just wondering whether, in fact, you know, whether WCO has specialized programs or pays greater attention to problems in developing countries.
Yes, I mean, I think certainly the challenges in terms of resources in the context and developing countries are also countries that suffer from fragile borders and social and economic instability. So those all create an even more complex environment. But one of the great things that we found in the WCO, and I think Tasha alluded to this as well, is that customs community, because when you boil it all down, we're all doing the same thing. We're all facing the same pressures. The shapes might be a bit different, But that's really where an organization like the WCO and the richness of the WCO exists to be able to create those links. And especially when we talk about sensitive matters such as corruption, it's much easier to listen and understand advice from those who are going through the same thing. And we find that that advice crosses economic economic development levels as well. So, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Andrea, and thank you for that question that was coming in from Pakistan. Tasha, let me turn to you. You teased us a little bit at the beginning about some of your work on supply chain. So let's dig a little bit deeper. Maybe you can explain how fighting corruption is critical to DHS's work on securing global supply chain from illicit trade.
Thank you for that, Jeff. And I'll start off by kind of highlighting one of the pieces that Andrea mentioned in, I think, her opening remarks, talking about the 10 or so kind of pieces that were really just essential in kind of level setting organization in terms of really addressing or tuning to integrity. When she talked about leadership, she talked about automation, transparency, et cetera. So I wanted to say in terms of the role and the way that DHS, CBP, and others work to address these issues. Certainly, we are taking that into account as we look to develop and mature and continue to grow as an organization. But I will say, to your point, I want to highlight a couple of pieces that the department and some of the components are doing in this space to kind of address kind of that global supply chain aspect from illicit trade. And so, want to underscore that the department is dedicated to preparing for, responding to, and mitigating all threats to U.S. critical infrastructure and the supply chain from illicit trade. And we're deeply committed to our national and economic security missions and ensuring all stakeholders are prepared to address that. So that constant communication, that constant engagement with stakeholders is really going to be key, and it's been a heart of our development of our Supply Chain Resiliency Center. And when we talk about international trade law enforcement, it has an important nexus to homeland security based on the inherent relationship between the U.S. border and cross-border trade. And so in the U.S., we're confronted with anti-competitive trade practices, duty evasion, counterfeit goods, and intellectual property theft, which deprives the United States from substantial lawful revenue and harms American businesses, our economic advantage, as well as individual consumers. So protecting American trade interests is only becoming more complex as the globalized marketplace flourishes and e-commerce rapidly expands its market share as an ever increasing percentage of traditional streams of commerce. Also want to kind of underscore the fact that DHS is constantly enhancing its trade enforcement security and facilitation capabilities to ensure legitimate trade, to contribute to the American economy prosperity, and to protect against risk to public safety and health. So additionally, I would say DHS is modernizing existing partnerships with members of the international trade community, and we're expanding existing safeguards and practices that prevent the importation of illicit and dangerous goods, products made with forced labor and intellectual property law violations. And I know those were kind of talked about in some of your key sectors within the report. And so again, looking forward to digging a little bit deeper into your report on those aspects. And just want to underscore, by leveraging our partner government agencies across the U.S., as well as our industry intelligence, DHS is strengthening the global trade network and increasing supply chain security to ensure that goods that are entering the U.S. are safe for American consumption and consistent with our values. I really quickly just want to emphasize a couple examples of what DHS components are doing to fight corruption while securing supply chain from illicit trade. So looking at CBP, one of the things that CBP does to ensure safe products do not enter the supply chain, they work very collaboratively with those partner government agencies and other foreign governments, as well as the trade, to better determine and assess risks through increased automation and sharing of information to encourage greater use of partnership and best practices to protect the U.S. consumer. CBP also secures ports of entries through the U.S. by facilitating the lawful flow of people and goods across our borders and deterring threats from bad actors. And CBP, I would say, has led the way in securing our trade infrastructure with innovative initiatives like the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, or CTPAT as we call it. And CBP has tailored this program for the maritime port community, developing security standards for maritime port authority, as well as terminal operators. And CBP leverages a wide range of trade data to target high-risk cargo, enforce our nation's trade laws, and protect key infrastructure and promote supply chain resilience. And so again, a big component of that certainly is the amount of data that our U.S. Customs and Border Protection, or CBP colleagues do receive, and the protection of that data, as well as safeguarding it, is also key to it, also enforcing the laws that we have to. And so just really quickly, companies who achieve CTPAT certification, again, they have to have a documented process for determining and alleviating risks through their international supply chain. And this allows companies to be considered low risk, resulting in an expedited processing of their cargo, including fewer customs examinations. And so we also have some other layered aspects to the security to reduce risk in our international space. And we're looking at that from our Cargo Security Initiative, or CSI, as we like to call it, which was announced back in 2002. And I know that program has grown now, not only looking for the traditional kind of counterterrorism aspect, but also growing to be more of looking at an all threats perspective. And CSI addresses the threat to border security and global trade that's posed by potential terrorists or other aspects to the international trade. And so one of the things I would just leave you with here, as I've kind of gone through some of the things that DHS and CBP is doing to address illicit trade in the international supply chain, is that, again, just underscoring the importance of our international initiatives, our international cooperation, and really strengthening our multi and bilateral relationships, because we understand that we can't do this alone. And as, again, zeroing in on the era of corruption, I do think when I'm talking about our supply chain resiliency centers, we're looking at those vulnerable aspects of the supply chain. That is an area we need to take. And so really just taking notes, listening to the other panelists. In fact, I may get in touch with some of you to kind of get some of the data points that you provided to really kind of help us better understand the scope of corruption and that greater connection, to ensure that we're plugging in the right data points to really be able to address some of the risks that we're seeing in international supply chains. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Jeff.
Tasha, thank you. That's an impressive portfolio of border control tools. I'm learning a lot. I'm hoping that everyone online is learning a lot. And again, I'm humorously say I'm glad I'm recording all of this. It's really quite impressive. Going back to what you said partway through your presentation, I'm quite pleased that the U.S. government was highlighting the forced labor aspect and human rights, tying that to human rights. TRACIT certainly was appreciative of the efforts that the U.S. took, joining with the EU and Japan about a year or so ago in emphasizing that. And we pointed out to all those governments the risk of demand for child and forced labor from counterfeiting and other illicit sectors, and promise to work and support your governments in that fight to protect human rights. So we're quite appreciative of the U.S. government in highlighting that. Thank you again. So we'll come back to you one more time. Let's see, in the last question in this first round, I'm going to turn to Daria. There's a lot of narrative about public-private partnerships, and when we listened to Marion talk about what the OECD is up to, she even touched on some of the priorities at the WTO. How does that sit with you? I mean, what can these organizations do to help your company fight illicit trade in terms of partnership or establishing rules and standards?
Thanks, Jeff. Probably I would kind of first address the help that organizations like TRACIT and Transparency International can give us, and then turn to OECD and the WTO and WCO as well. So in terms of TRACIT and Transparency International, I think I see a lot of complementarity in these two organizations and need to enhance the collaboration with your deep expertise in two areas. They're very complementary, as this report shows. When it comes to Transparency International, for instance, the Corruption Perception Index that you're developing is incredible tool for us, because it facilitates the data-based, constructive and solution-oriented conversation with the governments. that's kind of due to your reputation, due to your exposure and knowledge. That's something that is undisputable source and argument that we always bring up front. You mentioned also the investigations, and we've been in partnership with Transparency International France for the last over 10 years, and I had a chance to work with some of the national chapters of Transparency International too, and that's also a very helpful dialogue when we can, in a safe space, provide this information to an organization who can take it forward. So obviously that's an incredible help and enhance of our voice. And once again, TRACIT, with your knowledge and the experience in illicit trade, working with Transparency International on the same thing, topic will create a lot of added value. When it comes to the WTO, Marion actually said already what I wanted to say in terms of the way how illicit trade was tackled in the WTO from the topic that was a bit of a context, but not the core of the WTO. It gets more and more recognized in the WTO as a topic to deal with, and the rules of the WTO have a critical importance in tackling illicit trade facilitation rules, customs valuation, TBT, trade barriers to trade agreement, like in every TRIPS. So every agreement gives a certain framework to address illicit trade. What is important now is to start talking about illicit trade in these forums. So it's not yet granted. So, for instance, there is an interesting mechanism that exists in the WTO as a trade policy reviews of individual countries. So why not having a chapter on illicit trade when trade rules are revised? And when discussions are happening around draft regulations in the WTO, why not to start speaking about illicit trade and how this draft regulation will impact illicit trade and corruption in a given country? So right now, these topics sometimes are brought as a context, but I think this topic is merit to be brought on its own into these discussions. And OECD, in addition to the research that Marian already mentioned, I think this collaboration of like-minded countries could be very helpful, and be a platform where like-minded countries also agree on the need to address this issue in the WTO more regularly, and start doing it themselves, start doing it by example. So that's one thing. And on the cooperation with the WCO, obviously, enforcement is a core, digitalization, risk management, and so on and so forth. Everything that was already mentioned here. So in a sense, all this international collaboration across countries is helpful to us. Illicit trade becomes more and more international problem. So it needs to be, the solution is also at international level. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Daria, and thank you everyone for getting through the first round questions. So I'm looking at the time. We're running short on time, which is typical usually, but that's often a sign of a robust conversation. The second and last set of questions, really, we're looking at exploring the remedies. We've been talking a little bit about the problem. We've been talking about what your organizations do, a little bit about your stakeholders. And the last bit of this really was just to kind of focus on suggested remedies. I mean, clearly we had put some forward in our report. So let me make it easy on everyone as we go through this cycle one last time. Why don't I just ask you if you can maybe highlight some of the top remedies or recommendations or programs that your organization does to fix the problem, and maybe even some comments perhaps on how private sector can contribute to your work. And I'm going to just start with you, Mary, and a few words in that area would be welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. So I've already mentioned a few areas of our work, the trade facilitation work, where we try to make legal trade less costly. The recommendation on enhancing transparency in free trade zones, but we also have other tools. Another recommendation is very relevant for this discussion is the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention, that is meant to help governments agree to criminalize bribery of foreign public officials in international transactions. So this goes very much in the direction of combating bribery, combating corruption. You asked the question, how important is it to work with the private sector? Because we, of course, an intergovernmental organization. In our only very recently endorsed trade strategy, it's the first time that OECD has a trade strategy. We very much emphasize the importance of working with the private sector. And that's in general important because it's the private sector that trades. So if we design rules also at the border that don't work for the private sector, there won't be trade. But it's particularly important we consider in the current context where increasingly the focus of policies is on supply chains. And you heard in particular Tasha making reference to securing supply chains. Now, if we want our policies to work through the supply chain, or if governments increasingly use what sometimes is captured under the term corporate accountability tools, then those tools have to work through supply chains and have to work via suppliers towards final buyers. And we have a whole range of private actors that is connected to each other. It's very important to understand how the supply chain works and to understand how private sector actors interact with each other in order to make this work. We have at the OECD, you asked for other reference tools that we have at the OECD. We have an area of work that is called the responsible business conduct work, where we work with the private sector and with governments to understand what those who trade, the companies and often multinationals active in multiple jurisdictions, what they can do in order for the business to be conducted in a responsible way, be it responsible in terms of ESG terms, as Daniel referred to in his initial statements, or also in its conduct of legal trade, and therefore ensuring that along the supply chain, things like bribery, illicit trade, or corruption do not take place. So we have always worked closely with the private sector. In the OECD, this is institutionalized. There's something called BIAC, Business at OECD, that works within the organization, helps us to have access to business and facilitates the exchange between business and governments. And we think that this is particularly important in the field that we are discussing today, Jeff, corruption, illicit trade, and the interaction between the two phenomena. And it's particularly the case if we want to ensure that these two phenomena are being combated along the supply chains. So we are all in favor of more collaboration across governments, with other international organizations, non-government organizations, and with the private sector. And we believe it's the only way really to have a constructive way and a positive way forward, and to ensure that we can maintain open markets, but that this is done within a rules-based international trading system. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marion. I'm glad you mentioned business at the OECD. They do provide a very important conduit for business to engage at the OECD, and I know they have working groups on exactly the topics that we've been discussing today, whether that's just straight out trade issues or illicit trade issues, corruption and integrity. It's a very valuable forum, and we appreciate working with them. Let me now go to Andrea. Andrea, I know I've asked you about your programs, asked you a little bit about some of the solutions oriented toward developing countries. Just in your closing remarks, maybe ask you to highlight any remedies that you'd like to emphasize, or anything about working with the private sector you'd like to leave us with.
Sure, Jeff, thank you. The synthesis study that I mentioned, and I'm going to go back to the connection with organized crime, which is an issue that's felt not just by customs institutions, but also the private sector as well. So The symposium that I mentioned we did last November, we had representatives of the private sector consultative group of the WCO there, also sharing their experiences, how they protect their own organizations from organized criminal groups. But the study that I mentioned that Transparency International's Anti-Corruption Help Desk did for us, with us, was which is specifically geared towards asking that question: which integrity measures can customs institutions take to increase their resilience to organized criminal groups' use of corruption and physical threat? And the main finding was that customs administrations are best placed to take internally oriented measures to prevent and respond to the infiltration of organized criminal groups. And in addition, enhanced integrity measures do have the potential to make a positive contribution. And those sorts of measures include safe and secure whistleblowing mechanisms, lifestyle checks, staff rotation policies, and integrity training of officials. And these findings were largely validated by the experiences of our members and the private sector representatives who were at the symposium last November on the topic. And I think what was important to note is the call for internally oriented measures. And I think this echoes the political declaration of the 2021 special session of the UN General Assembly against corruption, which also highlighted the importance of sector or institution-specific approaches to corruption, particularly in areas of high risk, such as customs. So I know this is kind of a little bit at odds with the TRACIT report looking at cross-sectoral approaches. And of course, those are incredibly important as well. But with the World Customs Organization, our USP is customs. So all of what we are doing is looking at all of these integrity measures mentioned, which whistleblower protection, lifestyle checks, rotation policies, are pretty standard anti-corruption measures. You'll see them across sectors in private sector as well. But it's one thing to have checked the box that the whistleblower protection mechanisms are in place, but we also know that it's not a binary situation, and it's quite another thing to understand how effective those mechanisms are in the specific context with all of its complexities and in the day-to-day world of customs administration and operations. So what affects potential whistleblowers' decisions to use the mechanisms that are in place? How effective are rotation policies in the specific and geographically dispersed context of customs administrations? Do they disrupt the building of important skill sets, such as how to recognize fraud in valuation? Do they demoralize officers who have to move away from families and friends to remote areas and expose them to criminal gangs on the borders? These more granular, ground level and context specific questions are the ones that we're exploring with our members under the ACIT program. And while we don't yet have all the answers, we do already have a sense that we're heading in the right direction. We have developed a customs integrity perception survey that also adds more granularity to, for example, the broader global indexes, such as the CPI that was mentioned. And the surveys in the countries that we're working with have showed an overall improvement. And specifically data collected from more than 13,000 customs officials and 8,500 representatives from the private sector in 17 countries where second iterations of the survey have been delivered so far, show that improvement of perceptions across all respondents was recorded in more than 79% of the areas under which specific initiatives were made with direct support from the WCO ACIT program. So while we still have a lot to learn, we take heart from this sort of information, and especially as we take note of the concerning global trends showing crime is on the increase. We are optimistic that the more we learn together through our members and through our partners, such as those on this panel, the stronger our response will be in against this growing threat. So thank you again very much.
Thank you, Andrea. I think it's interesting that you mentioned the criminal nature of illicit trade. 2 or 3 points during your final presentation. I think something we're focusing on, and it's mentioned in the report, is the need for integrated border control, where customs is working more closely with law enforcement to address that criminal aspect of the whole problem. So I appreciate you raising that. And there is a question that came in also that kind of touches on this idea of more of the whole of government approach of how do we ensure that Justice Department and judges are involved in the process as well. And that's embodied in the recommendation. Corruption runs so deep and cuts across so many parts of society, not just society, but laws that are aimed toward protecting society. So we do need a holistic approach. Let me turn to Tasha as we're getting close to wrapping up the webinar today. Tasha, you know, like I said at the end of your last presentation, you've just shared such a wealth of information. I don't know if you have any more to add, so I'm just gonna say, listen, if you'd like to just take the last few minutes to make sort of a closing remarks, I'm welcoming you to do that at this time.
Thank you, Jeff. I do think that, first of all, hearing, Mary and Andrea's points and kind of the points that I've raised before, I do think that I've kind of hit a lot of the points that I did want to raise here, but would want to leave with just a couple of kind of closing remarks, and just really just kind of underscoring the importance of stakeholder engagement. And you mentioned the private sector. As I think about the work that we're doing in the forced labor space, a lot of it is groundbreaking, and it's in ways that we haven't really enforced in this way before. And so we have a lot of new tools. There's a lot of legislation which we're enforcing, and there's a lot of pressure to get it right and truly enforced. But at the same token, we always talk about the fact that our enforcement, there's two sides of the same coin. Certainly, we want to enforce, because that's really important. But there's also the facilitative nature as well. And so we see a way to get to that is really truly being open and communicative to the trade industry and talking to our partners about various ways and holding listening sessions for them to give us an opportunity to provide information, to provide choke points, to provide pain points in terms of them trying to be compliant with their importations. And so I just really want to underscore some of the things that we're certainly looking to do, particularly in this space. We've added FAQs to our website. Certainly, we provided a dashboard in terms of the number of enforcement stats that we have. We hold, biannual, opportunities to talk to various trade groups. We hold opportunities to talk to NGOs. We're out there, we're speaking about the work that we're doing, but we're also listening. And as things come up that are problematic in ways that may not be as transparent in the work that we're doing, we're looking for solutions. And we really have the position that the private sector, the trade community, for us, particularly in this forced labor space, they're like the eyes and ears on the ground. And really, they provide us invaluable information to be able to, one, kind of have this cross sharing of information and ways to look at we can get to the position where we can alleviate forced labor, obviously from the supply chain, but in the particular case, the United States, keeping it out of the U.S. commerce. And so just again, highlighting the importance of just working with the private sector and really just taking the opportunity to learn from like-minded partners and also others who are addressing this issue as well. So we'll continue working with our EU partners. We'll continue working with our partners in Japan and others. And we just really look forward to these type of opportunities, Jeff, to be able to kind of speak to the work that we're doing and really get an opportunity to hear and read reports such as this that will really truly inform the work and the way that we do our work going forward. So again, thank you for this opportunity and look forward for future engagement.
Thank you, Tasha. All right, I'm going to turn to Daria, our last speaker, and then I'll make some closing remarks and we're done for today. Daria, kind of same to you. I mean, we've touched a little bit on the relationship with TI and their products, the Corruption Perception Index. We talked a little bit already about working with OECD and WTO. Maybe just leave you with some closing remarks instead of a question.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. And very briefly, so there is no magic solution, not to illicit trade, not to corruption, right? It's a complex problem, and it will require a multi-layer solution. So what Tasha mentioned about the stakeholder engagement is a key. So I'm very grateful for her to reiterate in this point in her closing remark. What I really wanted to leave this conversation with is coming back to the report of TRACIT. The best thing would be, and I think for TRACIT and for Ulrika, who did this report, not just for interest in the topic, but It's just to make sure that this type of reports actually make their ways into the decision making, into the recommendations, into the work of international organizations, into the reflections of the governments, and they trigger conversations and trigger the solutions to improve the situation. So I really hope that that will be the case with this report, which is indeed excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Daria. All right, so listen, that concludes the program for today. I could endeavor to make some concluding remarks, but I think it's almost impossible. I've tried to at least keep up with our speakers as they've made some interesting comments all along. And as I said at the top of the presentation, I promise that we are going to produce a report trying to summarize the many conclusions and different projects and programs that were presented here. I think we, again, like I said, this is a great opportunity for us to learn a lot. What I can say in the end, though, is that clearly there's a deep intersection between corruption and illicit trade. We have to tackle this. It's evident, at least from our perspective, that no sector that's vulnerable to illicit trade is immune from the impacts of corruption. I mean, those two factors themselves, I think, compel forward action and compel us to look, under the covers a little bit. Because as long as illicit trade persists as a part of global commerce, it's critical that we need to address corruption if we're going to have any chance of solving it, or if we're going to have any chance of preserving the integrity of the global supply chain. I think the last thing I want to say, and this is something that we've been saying over and over on all aspects of our work, I think the UN Sustainable Development Goals exist for a very good reason. They're an excellent roadmap to our future for governments and for business and for citizens of the world to follow. And if the countries, if we're to meet those UN Sustainable Development Goals, specifically a focus on 16.5, which is to reduce corruption and bribery, it's going to be critical to prioritize the fight against illicit trade and the associated crimes of corruption. That's the only way we're going to be able to achieve goal 16.5. We're committed to do that. Clearly, our panelists are committed to do that and their organizations, and I look forward to working together with all of them to do that going forward. So as I conclude today's webinar, I want to thank each and every one of you for your remarks and your responses to our report. I want to thank everyone for dialing in, listening to what we had to say, contributing the questions, which I've done my best to integrate seamlessly into the dialogue as we've gone along. And with that, I thank you and wish you all a good day.